My name is Sophia Bennett. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, I believed I understood the architecture of my own life. On paper, I was the dependable one, the composed wife, the strategic operations director who could untangle corporate chaos without raising her voice. The woman who hosted seamless dinner parties, remembered birthdays without reminders, and kept joint investments organized in color-coded spreadsheets no one else ever opened. People tend to underestimate women like me. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for attention. I don't perform intelligence loudly. I listen. I absorb. I calculate quietly. To most people, including my husband, that translated to harmless, predictable, safe. This story isn't about dramatic betrayal in the way television writes it. There were no lipstick stains on collars, no late-night perfume trails, no screaming confrontations in hotel lobbies. It began with something much quieter. One night, I pretended to be asleep, and I heard my husband whisper to another woman, "Once she signs the asset authorization papers, I'll divorce her immediately." There's a particular kind of stillness that enters your body when reality rearranges itself in a single sentence. It doesn't feel like heartbreak at first. It feels like data. What I overheard that night wasn't just infidelity. It was planned. It was timing. It was legal language wrapped in intimacy. It exposed a calculated intention to strip me of financial leverage before walking away. And what makes this story different is not that I cried. I did. Not that I felt humiliated. I did. Not even that I was angry. It's what I chose to do next. This isn't a revenge story. There's no screaming, no shattered glass, no dramatic courtroom ambush. There is only strategy, patience, documentation, and silence. The kind of silence that people mistake for weakness until it's too late. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you who I was in that marriage, how I became invisible without realizing it. The small cuts were prepared for the wound. The night everything shifted, and the quiet steps I took that changed the outcome without ever raising my voice. I won't exaggerate. I won't glamorize pain, and I won't pretend I was fearless. But I will be honest. Have you ever realized, in a single quiet moment, that someone you trusted had already decided your future without you? To understand what happened, you have to understand who I was in that house. To Daniel, my husband, I was stability. He used to introduce me at networking dinners with a half smile and a light squeeze of my waist. "This is Sophia. She keeps everything running." Everyone would laugh politely, assuming he meant our home. He rarely clarified that I also oversaw operational strategy for a firm managing 9-figure portfolios. I never corrected them. It wasn't that he silenced me. It was subtler than that. He framed me. In his version of our marriage, he was the visionary, bold, entrepreneurial, charismatic. I was the grounding force, the calm one, the practical one, the risk assessor. It sounded balanced. It even sounded complimentary. But over time, calm became unshakable. Practical became predictable. Grounded became unthreatening. At social gatherings, if financial topics surfaced, Daniel would wave his hand lightly. "Oh, Sophia handles the details. I'm more of a big picture guy." People would nod as if that division made sense. What they didn't see was that most of those big picture investments had originated in my spreadsheets. The restructuring strategies, the tax sheltering ideas, the quiet alerts when market signals shift. I had never needed credit, or so I told myself. At home, my role was equally clear. I managed our joint accounts. I reviewed contracts before he signed them. I reminded him of renewal deadlines, adjusted our asset allocations, negotiated insurance terms, and optimized our mortgage refinancing. He trusted me with everything, which is why it took me so long to see that trust can sometimes be convenient. Daniel liked having a competent wife. He liked not worrying about logistics. He liked telling friends, "Sophia's got it covered." What he didn't like, though I didn't realize this until much later, was that my competence meant I didn't need him financially. And for a certain kind of man, that's a quiet threat. To his friends, I was intimidating at first, but actually sweet. To his mother, I was a bit reserved, but dependable. To our shared circle, I was the one who remembered anniversaries and sent thoughtful gifts. No one described me as powerful. Not even me! I had mastered the art of shrinking without disappearing. I laughed softly. I deferred in public disagreements. I let Daniel finish stories that I had started telling. Not because I was weak, because I valued peace, because I believed that marriages survived on compromise, because I thought love meant smoothing edges. If something felt slightly dismissive, I told myself it wasn't intentional. If my opinion was overridden, I reminded myself that partnership required flexibility. If Daniel made a decision without consulting me, I assumed he'd simply been busy. I became fluent in rationalization. Looking back, invisibility rarely arrives all at once. It's negotiated, and I negotiated pieces of myself away in exchange for harmony. The irony is this: the more efficient I became, the less visible I was. The more I protected our shared assets, the more he began to treat them as his future leverage. I was the architect of the house, but in his mind I was only maintaining it. And that distinction would matter, more than I understood at the time. If I trace everything back, it didn't begin with a whisper. It began with a signature. 2 years before the night I pretended to be asleep, Daniel came home unusually animated. He was pacing lightly, phone still in hand, eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen since his first startup pitch. "There's an opportunity," he said. "Short window, high upside." I was at the kitchen island reviewing quarterly reports, glasses low on my nose. I remember the exact scent in the air, a simmery chicken, slightly overdone. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked. "A private equity position, pre-expansion. My friend Lucas is already in." That was the first small detail that caught my attention. Lucas was charismatic, impulsive, frequently leveraged. "Send me the prospectus," I said gently. He hesitated. "It's pretty straightforward. I've already looked it over." Daniel was intelligent, but he was not meticulous. I was. "I'd still like to review it," I replied. Not as a challenge, but as a habit. He sighed, lightly but audibly. That sigh was the first cut. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even a disagreement. It was irritation at my caution. Later that night, he emailed me the documents. I read them twice. The valuation projections were inflated. The liquidity timeline was vague. There were clauses about secondary capital calls that felt buried deliberately. I walked into the living room where he was watching television. "There are risk layers here you're not seeing," I said calmly. "If this triggers additional capital obligations, it could tie up more than you're expecting." He muted the TV, but not fully. Just enough to signal partial attention. "You always assume worst case," he replied. "That's why you're good at your job. But sometimes growth requires risk." "I'm not against risk," I said. "I'm against poorly defined risk." There was a pause. And then he smiled. The kind of smile you use when humoring someone. "I appreciate that you worry," he said, "but I don't need you to manage this one." "I don't need you." The words were mild, reasonable, even framed as reassurance. But something in me catalogued them. It wasn't that he rejected my advice. It was that he framed my expertise as anxiety. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. Not because of the investment, we could absorb it if necessary, but because for the first time, I felt repositioned, from partner to cautious obstacle. The next week, he moved forward with the investment without incorporating any of my recommended safeguards. No side agreements, no protective clauses, no staggered capital commitments. I signed the joint authorization because technically the exposure was within our tolerance. But when I handed him the document, he kissed my forehead and said, "See, you're learning to loosen up." He meant it playfully. I smiled back, but internally I made a note. He didn't see my restraint as strength. He saw it as something to correct. No one else noticed this shift. To friends, we were still the balanced couple, the bold dreamer and the steady strategist. But that was the first moment I realized something subtle. Daniel didn't want a partner who evaluated him. He wanted a partner who validated him. And I had just crossed from the first category to the second. That cut was small, barely visible. But small cuts, when repeated, don't stay small. The thing about small cuts is that your body adjusts. You tell yourself it didn't hurt that much. You tell yourself you're being sensitive. You tell yourself love requires elasticity. After the investment incident, Daniel didn't become cruel. He didn't transform overnight. If anything, he became more charming, especially in public. But privately, a pattern began to form. It started with interruptions. We would be discussing something, refinancing a property, reallocating part of our portfolio, even planning a vacation. And I would begin outlining a structured approach. Halfway through, he'd wave a hand lightly. "Let's not overcomplicate it." Overcomplicate. That word appeared more often. When did I raise concerns about the liquidity strain from his investment? Overthinking. When I suggested we separate certain business liabilities from our shared accounts. Too cautious. When should I recommend we update our post-nuptial agreement after a significant asset increase? Why are you planning for disaster? Each time the tone was mild, slightly amused, never hostile. And that made it harder to challenge. Because how do you confront someone who is smiling? At dinner with friends one evening, the topic of long-term financial planning came up. A couple was debating whether to consolidate their investments. Daniel leaned back casually and said, Sophia could write a thesis on risk mitigation. She's allergic to volatility. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But what he had reduced to a personality quirk was actually my profession, my discipline, my value. Later that night, I told him quietly, I didn't love how you framed that. He looked genuinely confused. It was a compliment. It didn't feel like one. He shook his head slightly. You're reading too much into it. That phrase, you're reading too much into it, is one of the most effective erasers of intuition. So I adjusted. I softened my tone. I offered fewer counterpoints. I waited longer before giving opinions. I convinced myself that relationships have seasons, that perhaps Daniel felt overshadowed professionally. Maybe I needed to create more space for him to feel decisive. And in doing so, I began normalizing the dismissal. The second year of that pattern was quieter but more concerning. He stopped looping me into preliminary discussions about large financial decisions. I would hear about them after he had already expressed verbal interest. I didn't want to bother you until it was serious, he'd say. But seriousness is determined in early evaluation, not at the commitment stage. Still, I accepted the explanation, because confronting it felt disproportionate. Nothing explosive had happened. There were no obvious betrayals, just subtle repositioning, from co-strategist to final signature. And here's the truth I didn't want to admit then. Part of me believed that, if I stayed agreeable, he would eventually return to treating me as an equal. That patience would restore balance. That love would recalibrate respect. But respect, once eroded quietly, rarely rebuilds itself spontaneously. It erodes further, and by the time you realize it's structural, not incidental, you've already adjusted your weight to stand on uneven ground. I didn't know yet that the ground beneath me was being intentionally shifted. But I did know something felt off, and I chose comfort over confrontation. For a while. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you're no longer choosing your role. You're performing it. For me, that realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. Daniel began introducing me differently. Not in title, I was still my wife Sophia, but in tone. At events, he'd place a hand at the small of my back and say, she's the steady one, keeps me grounded. Again, it sounded flattering. Who doesn't want to be described as steady? But steady is static. Grounded is stationary. He was the one in motion, the one expanding, the one building. I was the infrastructure. Infrastructure isn't applauded, it's assumed. At home, the division deepened. He'd come to me when something required organization, negotiation, or cleanup. Taxes complicated. Sophia, can you look at this? Vendor contract unclear. Can you handle it? Asset restructuring paperwork? Just tell me where to sign. But when decisions were being made, bold moves, strategic risks, public declarations, those were his territory. I noticed something else too. When I spoke confidently in front of others, especially about finance or business, there was a subtle tightening in his jaw. He'd smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. After one dinner, where I had advised a friend about restructuring a family trust, Daniel said in the car, "You can be intense sometimes." About what? I asked. You don't have to prove you're the smartest person in the room. The statement stunned me. Not because it was loud, but because it was misplaced. I hadn't been proving anything. I had been helping. I wasn't competing, I said quietly. I know, he replied quickly. I just mean, sometimes it's okay to let other people lead. Other people. He meant him. That night, I stood in our bathroom brushing my hair and studied my reflection longer than usual. Had I been dominating, dismissive, threatening, or had I simply existed fully in rooms where he preferred I shrink? Over time, I began stepping back deliberately in public settings. I let him speak uninterrupted. I downplayed my professional role. I used softer language. I might be wrong, but... Just a thought. You probably know better, but I edited myself into palatability. Not because he demanded it explicitly, but because the atmosphere rewarded it. At family gatherings, his mother would say, Daniel has such big ideas. It's good he has someone practical beside him. Not with him. And I realized something unsettling. Everyone around us had accepted a narrative in which my strength was supportive, not equal, reliable, useful, invisible. I wasn't erased, I was positioned. And positioning matters, because when someone sees you as infrastructure rather than a partner, they begin making plans assuming you won't disrupt them. Looking back, this was the stage where my silence shifted from patience to self-abandonment. But at the time, I told myself I was being mature. Strategic marriages, I believed, required ego management. What I didn't understand yet was this. When you consistently dim your light to protect someone else's comfort, you don't create harmony. You create an imbalance. An imbalance invites exploitation. I just hadn't seen this blueprint yet. The shift didn't happen the night I heard the whisper. It happened months earlier, quietly alone, without witnesses. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unremarkable in every visible way. I was at my office reviewing quarterly performance summaries when a notification appeared from our joint banking portal. Asset authorization, pending signature. The subject line itself wasn't unusual. We occasionally consolidated holdings or adjusted management permissions for tax optimization. But when I opened this document preview, something in my body still dulled. The authorization would temporarily transfer discretionary control of two major shared accounts into a separate management structure. One that Daniel had recently established under an LLC. I hadn't been directly involved in creating. Technically, it was framed as operational efficiency. Simplification, streamlining. The language was clean, legal, professional. But it altered control. I read the document twice, then 3 times. There was nothing illegal in it. Nothing overtly alarming. But the timing unsettled me. The private equity investment he'd made 2 years prior had underperformed. Liquidity had tightened slightly. Not dangerously, but enough to require careful balancing. Transferring discretionary authority now would centralize decision-making under his newly formed structure. Without my signature, it couldn't proceed. When Daniel came home that evening, he was relaxed. "Oh, did you see the authorization request?" he asked casually while loosening his tie. "Yes," I replied. "It'll just make everything cleaner. Fewer signatures needed moving forward." Cleaner! I asked a few neutral questions. Timeline, rationale, structural details. His answers were smooth, almost rehearsed. Nothing he said was technically incorrect, but something felt accelerated. "I'll review it thoroughly," I said. He kissed my temple. "Of course. Take your time." Take your time! That phrase lingered, because beneath it I sensed impatience. That night, I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I didn't even express suspicion. Instead, I opened my leather portfolio and began doing what I do best. I mapped our assets. I traced historical transfers. I reviewed entity registrations tied to his LLC. Not obsessively, not emotionally. Methodically. And as I worked, something inside me changed. Not fear, not rage, clarity. For the first time, I wasn't analyzing as a supportive spouse. I was analyzing as an independent stakeholder. I stopped asking, "Is he being unfair?" and started asking, "What does this structure enable?" The answer wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't dramatic. It simply positioned him with unilateral flexibility. Flexibility I would no longer share. That Tuesday evening, sitting alone at my desk under soft lamplight, I realized something fundamental. I had been assuming alignment, but alignment requires transparency. And transparency requires voluntary inclusion. Daniel hadn't excluded me aggressively. Aggressively. He had excluded me strategically. There's a difference. That was the day something shifted. Not in our marriage, not yet. In me. I stopped trying to preserve the narrative of harmony, and I began quietly observing the architecture beneath it. I didn't refuse to sign. I didn't confront. I simply paused. And sometimes a pause is the beginning of power. Before that Tuesday, my silence had been adaptive. After that Tuesday, it became deliberate. There's a profound difference between not speaking because you want peace and not speaking because you are gathering information. Daniel noticed the pause around the authorization papers within a week. "Any thoughts?" he asked one evening, almost lightly. "I'm still reviewing," I replied calmly. He nodded, but I caught the flicker. Subtle impatience, quickly masked. That flicker confirmed something for me. This mattered to him more than he was letting on. So I continued doing what I had always done well. I listened, but now I listened for subtext. I noticed he began taking more calls outside, stepping onto the patio, even in colder weather. His voice dropped lower when discussing timelines. Words like, "once it's finalized" and "after consolidation" appeared more often. He assumed my silence meant compliance. He assumed I was processing slowly, maybe even reluctantly adjusting to change. He mistook my calm for passivity, and that miscalculation became my advantage. At dinner with friends, he started referencing our next phase more confidently. Streamlining everything, he'd say. Simplifying ownership. Ownership. I watched how easily he spoke about shared assets, as if they were already repositioned. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge him publicly. Instead, I began adjusting small things privately. I scheduled a consultation with a legal contact I trusted, framed as a general estate planning update. I reviewed our prenuptial agreement. It was solid but dated. Our asset growth over 12 years has changed the landscape significantly. I requested updated financial statements directly from institutions rather than relying solely on shared summaries. None of this was confrontational. It was precautionary. When Daniel asked again about the authorization papers, I smiled gently. I just want to ensure we're optimizing tax implications correctly. That answer satisfied him, because it aligned with the role he assigned me, the cautious one, the meticulous one. He didn't realize I had stopped protecting us and started protecting myself. The emotional shift was subtle but profound. I no longer felt hurt by his dismissals. I felt observant. I no longer argued about being included in decisions. I documented exclusion. And here's what I learned in that season of chosen silence. People reveal their long-term intentions when they believe you're not resisting. Daniel grew more comfortable describing his independent ventures as inevitable. He stopped softening language. He began speaking in assumptions rather than proposals. One night, he casually mentioned restructuring in case things ever changed. What things? I asked evenly. Oh, you know. Markets, life. I held his gaze a fraction longer than usual. He looked away first. Silence, when intentional, becomes a mirror. It forces the other person to fill space. And Daniel began filling it. With hints, with timelines, with confidence. He thought I was adjusting. What I was actually doing was preparing. There's a misconception that strength always announces itself. Sometimes strength is simply restraint with direction. By the time he believed I was finally softening into agreement, I had already shifted my internal allegiance. Not against him, but toward myself. And once that shift happens, it's irreversible. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine, which is why no one noticed mine. After the authorization request, I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking structurally. The first thing I did was separate knowledge from access. For years, Daniel and I had shared digital dashboards, investments, real estate holdings, business interests. Transparency had been effortless because I had curated it. Now, I began creating private redundancy. I downloaded historical statements and archived them offline. I mapped capital flows across the last 5 years. I noted every entity where ownership percentages had shifted, even slightly. There were no alarming discrepancies, but there were patterns. Gradual consolidation under his newer LLC, increasing autonomy in decision execution, subtle language in email threads that framed future moves as independent rather than collaborative. He wasn't stealing, he was positioning. And positioning is quiet. I also reviewed our prenuptial agreement more carefully than I had in years. It protected premarital assets well. But much of our growth had occurred after we married. Growth driven largely by joint reinvestment strategies I had structured. If discretionary control shifted before marital dissolution, valuation timing could become complicated. That word, timing, began echoing in my mind. One afternoon, I met with a senior estate attorney I'd known professionally for over a decade. I didn't mention divorce. I didn't mention suspicion. I simply asked, hypothetically, how asset control structures affect marital leverage if one spouse initiates separation shortly after restructuring. He didn't look surprised. He explained calmly, control first, conversation later is a common sequencing strategy in high asset marriages. Common. The word didn't sting. It clarified. When I returned home that evening, Daniel was cheerful. He'd received positive news about one of his ventures. I congratulated him sincerely, and I watched. I noticed how he referred to my expansion instead of our expansion, how he spoke about future flexibility, how he used phrases like once things are streamlined. Once. The authorization papers remained unsigned. He stopped asking daily, which told me he believed I was nearing compliance. Meanwhile, I began strengthening my independent position. I quietly reactivated a dormant consulting relationship framed as professional development. I ensured my personal savings were appropriately diversified and legally insulated. I updated beneficiary designations where applicable, not vindictively, but prudently. Nothing I did violated trust. It simply reduced vulnerability. The emotional transformation during this period surprised me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't devastated. I was focused. The more I prepared, the less reactive I felt. There's something grounding about documentation, about knowing the exact landscape you're standing on. And here's what no one, not Daniel, not his friends, not even my own family, were understood. I had stopped assuming good faith, not because I had proof of betrayal, but because I had proof of strategy. And strategy requires counter-strategy. Late at night, when Daniel believed I was asleep, I would lie still and listen to his breathing. Steady, unbothered. I wondered whether he believed I would never disrupt his plan, whether he saw me as too composed to ever become decisive. The irony is this: my composure was never submission. It was discipline. By the time the whisper happened, the sentence that would remove all remaining ambiguity, I had already built scaffolding beneath myself. I just didn't yet know how necessary it would become. Preparation doesn't feel dramatic in real time. It feels like paperwork. Calendar invites, quiet meetings, updated passwords. But preparation is power in slow motion. And I was almost finished preparing. The night it happened, I wasn't suspicious. I was tired. Daniel had come home later than usual, phone still in hand, voice low as he walked through the hallway. I was already in bed, the room dim except for the soft amber glow of the bedside lamp I hadn't turned off yet. When he stepped into the bedroom, I closed my eyes. Not theatrically, not strategically, just instinctively. He assumed I was asleep. He stepped back into the hallway, and that's when I heard it. His voice softened. Not the confident cadence he used in business calls, but something intimate, almost reassuring. No, she'll sign. She just likes reviewing details. A pause. A faint exhale of amusement. Once she signs the asset authorization papers, I'll divorce her immediately. Silence on my end. My breathing didn't change. My body didn't move. Inside something crystalline formed. There are moments when shock feels loud, racing heart, trembling hands. This wasn't that. It was cold clarity. I listened. He continued in a measured tone. It's cleaner this way. Control first. Conversation after. I don't want a drawn-out fight. Another pause. She won't see it coming. That sentence landed differently. Not because it was cruel, but because it was confident. He wasn't angry with me. He wasn't leaving out of resentment. He was sequencing an exit. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. No dramatic declarations, no insults about me, no emotional heat. Just logistics. When he returned to the bedroom, I maintained stillness. He slid into bed, careful not to disturb me. His breathing slowed, and I stared into the darkness, eyes open now, absorbing. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for realizing you were never in the room where your future was decided. It doesn't scream. It reorganizes. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about the other woman. Her identity felt secondary. What struck me was precision. The authorization, the consolidation, the urgency. It wasn't a coincidence. It was choreography. And here's the part that surprised me most. I didn't cry. Not that night. I felt something far more stabilizing. Validation. Every pause I had taken, every document I had reviewed, every quiet consultation. They weren't paranoid. They were intuitive. And now intuition had evidence. I lay there for hours, not spiraling, not fantasizing about confrontation. I was recalculating timelines. If I signed, he would initiate separation immediately, likely within days, perhaps weeks. With centralized control already shifted, he would negotiate from strength. If I refused abruptly, suspicion would accelerate his plan prematurely. Emotion would compromise leverage. So I chose neither reaction. Instead, I chose composure. The next morning, I made coffee as usual. Asked about his day, kissed him goodbye. He studied me for a fraction of a second longer than normal, perhaps checking for signs of awareness. I gave him none, because the private reveal wasn't for him. It was for me. In that 4-minute whisper, the ambiguity dissolved. I no longer had to interpret patterns. I had confirmation. And confirmation removes hesitation. People imagine betrayal triggers explosions. Sometimes it triggers precision. I didn't feel rage. I felt awake. And once you are awake to someone's strategy, you stop moving emotionally. You move structurally. That morning, I opened my leather portfolio. And for the first time, I wasn't preparing for what if. I was preparing for when. After the whisper, I had options. That's the part people don't often see. They assume betrayal creates only two paths: confrontation or collapse. But strategy always offers more than two. Option one was immediate exposure. I could have walked into the kitchen the next morning, placed the unsigned authorization papers on the counter, and said calmly, "I heard you." I could have watched his face rearrange itself, could have demanded an explanation, could have forced the conversation before he was ready. It would have felt powerful, and it would have been strategically reckless. Option two was a quiet refusal. Simply decline to sign, provide no explanation, let the tension build until he either abandons the plan or escalates prematurely. That would have protected assets in the short term, but it would also have signaled awareness without leverage. Option three was compliance. Sign. Let him initiate the divorce on his timeline, rely on legal systems to rebalance power afterward. That option required trust in fairness over preparation. I don't gamble on fairness. There was a fourth option: restructure before he could. The whisper gave me something invaluable: sequencing. He believed control would transfer first, divorce would follow. If I moved first, without alerting him, I could alter the sequence, not to punish, but to neutralize. Over the next 72 hours, I reviewed everything again with new context. Our marital estate was substantial, but complex. Multiple accounts, layered investments, real estate holdings with varied titling structures. The authorization papers would centralize discretionary movement. But they were not the only structural mechanism available. There were clauses within our prenuptial agreement regarding fiduciary duties during periods of anticipated material change. Ambiguous language, intentionally so, but legally significant. I scheduled another meeting with my attorney. This time I was direct. If a spouse is planning separation contingent upon asset restructuring, I asked, what protections exist if the other spouse has reasonable suspicion but no formal disclosure? He listened carefully. Intent matters, he said. Timing matters more. That sentence anchored my decision. Timing matters more. I didn't need to prove betrayal. I needed to secure a position. So I chose the irreversible option. Not confrontation. Not compliance. Initiation. I began preparing my own formal review of our asset structure under the guise of estate optimization. I requested temporary freezes on discretionary transfers above a certain threshold, citing tax planning reassessment. Legitimate, procedural, non-accusatory. I did not sign the authorization, but I did not refuse it either. Instead, I introduced parallel documentation that required joint acknowledgement before any structural shift could proceed. It was subtle, invisible to anyone not trained in financial architecture. Daniel didn't react immediately. He likely assumed it was my usual thoroughness. He underestimated that thoroughness. The decision point wasn't emotional. It was architectural. I wasn't choosing whether to stay or leave. I was choosing whether to be repositioned or to reposition. And once I signed the preliminary protective filings that afternoon, something settled inside me. Not relief, finality. Because whatever happened next would no longer be on his timeline alone. It would be ours. And that difference changes outcomes. Once I made the decision, everything became procedural. There's a misconception that strategic action feels dramatic. It doesn't. It feels administrative. The first formal step I took was requesting a comprehensive marital asset review under the pretext of long-term estate optimization. I framed it as something I had been meaning to revisit anyway. Daniel didn't question it. In his mind, I was returning to form, the meticulous, cautious Sophia who liked clean ledgers and updated documentation. What he didn't realize was that certain filings trigger automatic protections, temporary transactional thresholds, mandatory dual acknowledgement clauses, notification requirements for significant structural transfers. Nothing accusatory, nothing aggressive, just friction. Friction is powerful, especially when someone is trying to move quickly. Within days, I ensured that all major financial institutions required written confirmation from both of us for any restructuring above a modest percentage threshold. I cited internal compliance standardization. It sounded corporate, boring, responsible. Daniel signed the updated compliance acknowledgements without reading them carefully. He trusted my paperwork. That trust was the quiet irony. I also scheduled a formal valuation of several shared assets. Again, reasonable. Markets had shifted. Updated appraisals were sensible. But updated valuations create documented timestamps. And timestamps anchor leverage. At home, nothing changed externally. I still made dinner, still asked about his meetings, still listened to him discuss next phases. He grew slightly more impatient about the authorization papers. "Are we close?" he asked one evening. "I just want to align it with the broader review," I replied calmly. "It makes more sense to restructure everything cohesively." Cohesively. He nodded, though I saw the tightening again, the subtle awareness that momentum had slowed. Momentum is fragile when it relies on assumptions. Behind the scenes, I finalized a separate legal consultation regarding asset preservation in anticipation of potential marital dissolution. I didn't file for divorce. I didn't alert him, but I prepared the paperwork. Prepared paperwork doesn't accuse. It waits. Emotionally, something unexpected happened during this phase. I stopped feeling betrayed. Not because betrayal hadn't occurred, but because my focus shifted from pain to position. Pain is reactive. Position is deliberate. When you move deliberately, you reclaim agency. Daniel began making more calls outside again. His tone occasionally edged toward urgency. I didn't listen for content anymore. I listened for pressure, and pressure was increasing. He assumed delay was caution. He didn't realize the delay was recalibration. One afternoon, I received confirmation that the transactional safeguards were fully in place across all primary institutions. I closed my laptop and sat very still. For the first time since the whisper, I allowed myself a long breath. Not of victory, of equilibrium. Whatever he was planning would now unfold on level ground. He could still leave. He could still file. But he could no longer strip structural leverage first. Silence, when paired with preparation, becomes architecture. And by the time he believed I was finally nearing signature, the foundation beneath his plan had already shifted. He just didn't know it yet. The first sign wasn't confrontation. It was confusion. About 3 weeks after I initiated the structural review, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He dropped his keys on the entry table a little harder than necessary. "Did something change with the accounts?" he asked, trying to sound casual. I looked up from the dining table where I was reviewing routine reports. "What do you mean?" "I tried to move capital into the LLC holding structure, and compliance flagged it. They said dual authorization thresholds were updated." "Yes," I said evenly. "I standardized them across the board. It's cleaner that way." "Cleaner." I watched the world land. He blinked once. "Since when do we need additional review for internal transfers?" "Since our asset complexity increased," I replied. "It's risk management." The same phrase I had used for years, now applied neutrally. He nodded slowly, but something in his posture shifted. The easy confidence, the assumption of forward motion, had encountered resistance. Not rejection, resistance. Over the next several days, I noticed small fractures. He spent longer on calls. His tone sharpened. Words like unexpected delay and temporary complication surfaced more frequently. One evening, I heard him say quietly, "No, it's procedural, just more documentation than anticipated." Documentation. I almost smiled at the symmetry. At dinner, he seemed distracted. "Is the authorization ready yet?" he asked again, this time with a trace of urgency he hadn't shown before. "I'm aligning it with the valuation updates," I replied. "It would be inefficient to sign before final numbers are confirmed. Valuations create anchors. Anchors prevent sudden movement." He exhaled slowly. "You're being overly cautious." "Perhaps," I said softly, "but caution protects the both of us." Both. The word lingered between us. For the first time, I saw something flicker behind his composure. Not guilt. Inconvenience. His plan had assumed fluidity. Instead, he encountered structure. And structure demands patience. He didn't accuse me. He didn't escalate. But I sensed recalculation. He began asking more indirect questions about timelines, about liquidity, about my consulting reactivation. "You're taking on more lately," he observed one night. "I like staying sharp. That was true. Staying sharp means staying prepared. The consequences were subtle but undeniable. The momentum he had built quietly with someone else was slowing. Conversations likely promised swift transitions, clean exits, immediate action. Now everything requires review, and review requires explanation. Explanation creates pressure. One afternoon, he received a call that visibly unsettled him. He stepped outside, voice low but tense. When he returned, he didn't meet my eyes immediately. I didn't ask questions. Silence again became a mirror. The more procedural friction increased, the less certain he appeared. Not panicked, but aware. He was beginning to realize that the narrative of "she won't see it coming" was dissolving, even if he didn't yet know why. Consequences don't always arrive as explosions. Sometimes they arrive as paperwork, as thresholds. as timelines that refused to accelerate. And for the first time since the whisper, I saw something shift in him. Not dominance, doubt. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like forced normalcy. About a month after the structural safeguards were fully in place, Daniel suggested we take a weekend trip. Just us, he said. We haven't disconnected in a while. It was an unusual proposal. We travelled often, but usually tied to conferences or social events. This sounded restorative. I'd like that, I replied. And I meant it. Not because I believed reconciliation was forming, but because clarity deserves observation. We drove north to a quiet coastal town. The air was cold, the ocean subdued. At dinner that night, he was attentive in a way he hadn't been for months. He asked about my consulting work. He complimented my insight. He even apologized, vaguely, for not always appreciating how much you handle. It would have moved me deeply 6 months earlier. Now I listened for timing. The next morning, over coffee, he brought it up. I've been thinking, he began carefully. Maybe we don't need to rush the restructuring. Maybe we can simplify some things instead. Simplify. This is from the man who had been accelerating consolidation. I thought streamlining was important, I said calmly. It is. Maybe we overcomplicated it. Overcomplicated. The irony wasn't lost on me. What he didn't know was that the valuations had been finalized 2 days prior. Documentation was time-stamped. Institutional safeguards were active. Legal advisories were recorded. Whatever sequence he had originally planned was no longer accessible. I'm comfortable taking time, I said gently. There's no urgency. There it was. The subtle confirmation. There had been urgency, and now it was gone. That afternoon, as we walked along the shoreline, he reached for my hand more often than usual. He seemed almost reflective. I don't want us to drift, he said quietly. I studied him. Drift implies mutual distance. But what had been happening wasn't drift. It had been designed. I don't want that either, I replied truthfully, because I didn't want hostility. I didn't want spectacles. But I also didn't want to remain strategically exposed. When we returned home, he stopped asking about the authorization papers. Completely. Silence from his side now, which told me everything. He had recalculated and found the window closed. Perhaps conversations with the other woman had shifted. Perhaps expectations had been set that could no longer be met swiftly. Perhaps he was buying time. But the fundamental reality had changed. He no longer controlled the sequence. A week later, he approached me in the kitchen, expression carefully neutral. If we ever needed to reassess everything, he said slowly, we'd handle it fairly. Fairly. The word felt almost tender. I would expect nothing less, I answered. And I meant that too, because fairness, when documented properly, isn't emotional. It's structural. By the time he realized acceleration was impossible, the legal and financial terrain had stabilized. Too late to fix the original plan. Too late to execute the whisper. Not because I had attacked, but because I had anchored. And once anchors are set, momentum shifts permanently. The confrontation didn't erupt. It unfolded. 2 weeks after our coastal trip, Daniel came home unusually quiet. He stood in the doorway of my home office, the same room where I had mapped every asset, every clause, every timeline. Can we talk? He asked. I closed my laptop gently. Of course. We sat across from each other at the small round table by the window. Late afternoon light filtered in, soft and unthreatening. He didn't begin with accusations. He began with a question. Have you been preparing for something? I held his gaze steadily. I've been preparing responsibly, I said. He nodded once. It feels like you anticipated a shift. There it was. Not awareness of what I knew, but awareness that his momentum had been intercepted. I sensed structural imbalance, I replied calmly, and I corrected it. His jaw tightened slightly. You could have talked to me. I could have, I agreed, but certain conversations require honesty on both sides. The air shifted then. Not explosive, heavy. He looked down at his hands before speaking again. You think I was planning something? I don't think, I said softly. I evaluate patterns. Silence stretched between us. He didn't deny it outright. That was the confirmation. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he said finally. I know! I answered. And I did. His plan had not been emotional vengeance. It had been a strategic exit. Control first, conversation after. The same structure I had quietly dismantled. You changed the sequence, he said almost to himself. Yes, the simplicity of that word seemed to land deeper than any accusation could have. He leaned back slightly, studying me in a way he hadn't in years. You're not angry, he observed. I was, I said truthfully, for a moment. And now? Now I'm clear. Clarity unsettles people more than rage. Rage can be negotiated with. Clarity cannot. He exhaled slowly. I didn't think you'd move like that. Move like that, meaning preemptively, strategically, without confrontation. You didn't think I was paying attention, I corrected gently. Another silence. This one is softer. I underestimated you. He admitted. There was no triumph in hearing that. Just confirmation. I allowed that, I replied. And that was the closest I came to self-blame. Not for his plan, but for the years I had minimized my presence. We didn't shout, we didn't cry. There were no accusations about the other woman. Her existence was implicit in the architecture of his plan. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now, I said, folding my hands calmly on the table. We move forward honestly, or we move forward separately, but we don't sequence deception. The line was firm, not cruel. He nodded slowly. For the first time in years, he looked at me not as infrastructure, but as an equal force. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with recognition. And recognition changes the terrain permanently. We did not repair the marriage, and we did not destroy it dramatically either. What followed was measured. Attorneys, mediation, structured conversations that were sober rather than explosive. The separation unfolded with dignity because the foundation beneath it had already been stabilized. There was no financial ambush, no desperate scrambling, no theatrical courtroom moment. Just process. Daniel moved into a high-rise apartment downtown 3 months later. The other woman eventually became visible, though by then she felt like a footnote rather than a headline. People expected me to collapse. They expected bitterness or vindication. What they saw instead was continuity. I kept working. I expanded my consulting portfolio. I moved into a smaller townhouse with more light and fewer rooms to maintain. For the first time in years, my life felt aligned with my internal voice rather than someone else's comfort. Here's what changed most. I stopped editing myself. In meetings, I speak directly now, without prefacing insight with apology. At social events, I don't downplay my expertise to soften male egos. In relationships, romantic or otherwise, I watch for positioning early, not with suspicion, with awareness. Daniel and I occasionally speak, cordially. We share a history that doesn't require hostility. He once told me, months after everything settled, you were always stronger than I realized. I didn't correct him. Strength wasn't new. Visibility was. The emotional wound I carried for years, the fear of being too much, dissolved quietly during this process. I wasn't too much. I had been precise enough. Enough to see patterns. Enough to anticipate strategy. Enough to move without spectacle. What I learned is this. Quiet does not mean compliant. Calm does not mean unaware. Love does not require self-erasure. And perhaps most importantly, preparation is not paranoia when intuition has already whispered. I no longer measure myself by how well I maintain peace. I measure myself by how aligned my actions are with my values. Integrity without self-sacrifice. Compassion without naivety. Clarity without cruelty. There's a particular steadiness that comes from knowing you protected yourself without becoming destructive. That's who I am now. Not the invisible infrastructure, not the underestimated wife, but a woman who understands that silence, when chosen intentionally, can be the most powerful form of authorship. And I no longer hand authorship of my life to anyone else. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, you might be waiting for a final dramatic twist. There isn't one. No public humiliation, no revenge reveal, no moment where I exposed him in front of a room full of people. The quietest decisions often shape life the most permanently. What happened to me wasn't just about infidelity. It was about sequencing, about control disguised as practicality, about how easily someone can mistake composure for blindness. But here's the truth that matters more than what he planned. I was not saved by luck. I was not rescued by sudden evidence. I was not empowered by rage. I was protected by attention, by listening when something felt slightly off, by documenting instead of denying, by choosing timing over reaction. We often think strength is loud, that it announces itself with confrontation. But sometimes strength is the refusal to move prematurely. Sometimes it's the discipline to prepare without performing. And sometimes it's the courage to let someone underestimate you, while you quietly rebalance the ground beneath your feet. If you find yourself in a situation where something feels misaligned, not dramatically wrong, just subtly shifted, don't silence that awareness to preserve comfort. You don't need to accuse immediately. You don't need to explode. You don't need to panic. But you do need to pay attention, because the people who plan in whispers often assume you aren't listening, and listening changes outcomes. I don't hate Daniel. I don't wish him harm, but I no longer shrink to make anyone else feel larger. That is the real ending. So I'll leave you with this. If you discovered in a quiet moment that someone had already decided your future without you, would you react or would you reposition? I'd genuinely like to know how you would choose to move.